Mira walked slowly along the dusty road that stretched out of town and wound into the hills. Her shoes were worn and her small bag was heavy on her shoulder, but she did not stop. The sun was lowering in the sky, and she wanted to reach the cabin before nightfall. She carried only the bag, a lantern, and a folded letter. The letter was all that gave her hope, because it told her that she was not completely lost in the world. Only a few weeks ago, Mira had buried her husband. He had been a kind man, but he had left behind more debts than savings. The bank had taken their small house, and the shop that once sold cloth and tools had been closed. Neighbors had shown pity, but pity could not pay for bread. She had slept on a friend's floor for a short while, but she knew she could not stay there forever. Then the letter had arrived, signed by a lawyer in town. It said that an uncle she had never met, a quiet man who had lived alone, had left her his property. The property was a cabin in the hills, far from the busy town streets. The townspeople had spoken when she told them. Some warned her that the cabin was haunted. Others laughed and said the cabin had no value at all. One old man in the market said that long ago outlaws had hidden in those hills, and maybe one of them had lived in the cabin. Mira had listened, but she did not turn back. She thought to herself that any roof was better than none, and any home was better than the cold ground. When she finally reached the place, the cabin stood quiet under the evening light. It was small, with dark wood walls that had aged in the wind. The roof looked patched in places, as if storms had torn it apart more than once. Grass and weeds grew around the door, and the windows were cloudy from dust. A wooden fence leaned half-broken on one side, and a rusted bucket sat near the well. Mira placed her bag down and pushed open the door. The door gave a long creak and dust flew into the air. The cabin smelled of wood, earth, and old smoke. Inside she found a single room with a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with books, and a rusty stove in the corner. A ladder led to a loft above, where a small bed waited, covered in a faded quilt. She stood there for a moment, letting her eyes take in the place. It was not rich, it was not grand, but it was hers. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt that something belonged to her. She smiled, a faint but real smile, and then she set to work. She opened the windows to let the fresh air in. She swept the floor with an old broom she found behind the stove. She shook the dust from the quilt and beat it outside. The work tired her, but it also calmed her. When night came, she lit her lantern and made tea with water from the well. She sat by the fire she managed to start in the stove and warmed her hands. The sound of the wind outside and the crackling of wood filled the small room. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself that she would endure, no matter how hard life had become. The next morning, Mira began to explore the cabin more closely. She wanted to know what had been left behind by the uncle she never knew. On the shelf she found books about farming, maps of the hills, and some old letters tied with string. In the corner stood 3 wooden trunks. 2 were easy to open. They held tools, blankets, and worn clothes. The 3rd trunk was heavier. When she opened it, she found blankets on top, but when she lifted them, her eyes widened. Beneath the blankets was a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked, the strap still tied, and the pages yellow with age. On the first page were initials, but they were not the initials of her uncle. The handwriting was sharp and hurried, as if written by someone always on the move. Mira carried the journal to the table and began to read. At first she thought it was only a diary, but soon she realized it was something far more unusual. The writer spoke of long rides at night, of hiding from men who hunted him, of camps in canyons, and of meetings under the moon. He spoke of stolen gold, of wagons heavy with coins, and of narrow escapes from lawmen. Mira's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The journal belonged to an outlaw. Perhaps he had hidden in this very cabin, or perhaps the cabin had once been his home. The words painted a picture of danger, but also of secret wealth. The outlaw described a mine rich with gold hidden somewhere in the hills. He gave clues, but not in full detail. He wrote about a rock shaped like an eagle, a river that bent like a horseshoe, and a cave sealed with stones. He wrote that the mine held more gold than any man could carry, and that he alone knew the path to it. Mira closed the journal and pressed it against her chest. Her breath came quick and her thoughts raced. If the journal was true, then there was a treasure waiting somewhere in the mountains. Gold that could change her life forever. She could pay her debts, she could build a new home, she could live without fear of hunger. But a shadow of worry also filled her. If others ever learned about this journal, they might come for it and for her. Men who were desperate for gold could be dangerous. She whispered to herself that no one must know. That night she dreamed of tunnels filled with shining stones, of rivers flowing with gold, of her hands full of coins. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding. The fire had gone out and the cabin was cold, but her mind was burning with a new purpose. She was not only a widow left with nothing. She was the keeper of a secret. She walked outside and looked at the hills. The air was cool, and the first light of morning touched the peaks. The mountains seemed silent, but she felt as if they held voices calling to her, telling her to search, to follow the clues, to uncover what had been hidden. Mira gripped the journal in her hands and whispered, "I will find it." She did not yet know what dangers or trials waited, but she knew one thing with certainty. Somewhere out there, buried under rock and earth, lay the outlaw's gold, and she was ready to begin the search. Mira woke with the first light of morning. The air in the cabin was cool, and smoke from last night's fire had faded. She sat on the edge of her small bed in the loft and stared at the journal resting on the table below. The book looked ordinary, but it was not. It carried a secret that could change her life. She climbed down, lit her lantern, and set water on the stove. As she drank her tea, she opened the journal again. Her eyes moved carefully over each word. The outlaw's handwriting was messy, but she was learning how to read it. The entries were short and sharp, written in a tone of a man who always looked over his shoulder. He wrote of narrow escapes and of men who wanted him dead. But the parts that caught Mira's attention were the clues to the gold mine. The outlaw had not written the location clearly. Instead, he left signs as if he wanted only himself to understand them. She read about the Eagle Stone, a tall rock shaped like the head of a bird. She read about the Horseshoe Bend, where a river curled back on itself like a great loop. She read about a cave sealed by time, its mouth closed by falling stones. Each note was written as if the man wanted to hide the place from everyone else but keep the memory fresh for himself. Mira closed the book and whispered to herself that she must see the land with her own eyes. The hills around her were wide and wild. She would need to explore them slowly, step by step. But she could not begin her search without preparing. She needed food, rope, a shovel, and stronger shoes. The cabin had only a few supplies. That afternoon she walked back down to town. She sold one of her uncle's extra tools for a little money. With that she bought bread, dried meat, a small coil of rope, and a tin of matches. She also bought paper and a pencil, for she wanted to make her own notes. The shopkeeper asked why she needed rope, but Mira only smiled and said she wished to repair the fence at the cabin. She told no one the truth. When she returned, she placed the supplies neatly in a corner. She sat again with the journal and drew a map on her new paper. She copied every clue from the outlaw's notes, then sketched the hills as she remembered them. She marked streams and paths, valleys and ridges. She did not know where the Eagle Stone or Horseshoe Bend were yet, but she trusted she would find them if she looked hard enough. The days passed as she worked. In the mornings, she walked the trails near the cabin, studying the shape of rocks, the bend of rivers, the patterns of trees. In the evenings, she returned to the cabin and added details to her map. Each step made her feel closer to the truth. One morning, she climbed a ridge that stood higher than the rest. From the top, she could see far across the hills. To the west, she noticed a tall rock that rose above the trees. At first, it looked like any other stone, but when she stared longer, she saw that its top curved out like a beak. Her heart raced. Could this be the Eagle Stone written in the journal? She hurried down the slope and walked toward it. The path was rough and her feet ached, but she kept moving. After hours, she reached the base of the great rock. When she tilted her head back, the shape was clear. It truly did look like the head of a bird. She touched the stone and whispered that the outlaw had stood here too. She looked around carefully. The journal had said that near the Eagle Stone, a man should follow the river. Mira searched until she found a narrow stream trickling between the trees. It led downward and she followed it. The stream grew wider and after some distance it turned sharply, curling back on itself like a loop. Mira gasped. It was the Horseshoe Bend. Her heart filled with excitement. 2 signs from the journal had revealed themselves in one day. She sat on the bank of the stream and opened her book. She read the outlaw's words again. They said that beyond the bend, the cave could be found. The cave that held the entrance to the lost gold mine. But the journal also warned that the path was dangerous. The outlaw had written of loose rocks, narrow ledges, and the echo of wolves at night. Mira felt a chill run through her. She had found the first clues, but the hardest part still lay ahead. The sun began to set, and she knew she could not search for the cave in the dark. She hurried back toward the cabin, marking trees with small cuts from her knife so she could find her way again. She reached the cabin long after nightfall, tired but filled with fire inside her heart. That night she dreamed again of gold shining in the dark. But in her dream, she also saw shadows of men chasing her, hands grabbing at the journal, voices shouting in anger. She woke with sweat on her face and clutched the book tightly. She whispered to herself that she must be careful. The next day, Mira returned to the horseshoe bend with a small bag of food, a lantern, and her rope. She followed the stream beyond the bend, her eyes sharp for any sign of a cave. The ground grew rocky and the trees thinned. She climbed over boulders and crossed slippery stones. Hours passed and she began to doubt. But then she noticed a wall of rocks that seemed unnatural. They were piled as if they had fallen long ago. But behind them was a hollow space. She stepped closer and touched the cool stone. A faint breeze came through cracks. Her heart jumped. This could be the cave sealed by time. She pressed her ear against the gap. The sound of air whispered through, cold and deep. She pulled back and stared at the pile. It would take hours, maybe days, to clear the stones. She would need tools and strength. But she felt sure now that she had found the right place. Mira marked the spot carefully on her map. She whispered a promise to return and uncover what lay hidden inside. She knew the gold was near, but so were danger and hardship. She carried the journal in her bag and walked back to the cabin as the light faded. When she reached home, she sat by the fire, her body sore but her spirit strong. She had followed the first signs and they had led her to the sealed cave. The outlaw's words were not lies. The mine was real. The gold was real. But Mira also knew she could not do this alone. The stones were too heavy and the cave might be too dangerous. She would need help, yet she feared who to trust. If she chose wrongly, she might lose everything. As the fire crackled, she held the journal close and whispered, "I must be wise." The hills outside lay silent, but Mira felt as if the past was watching her, guiding her and testing her. Somewhere beneath those stones, fortune was waiting, and she was ready to claim it. The fire in the cabin burned low as Mira sat staring at the journal. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, but her mind refused to rest. She had found the eagle stone, the horseshoe bend, and even the cave sealed by fallen rocks. The outlaw's words had proven true, and now the lost gold mine lay within her reach. Yet the stones blocking the cave were heavy, and the work too great for one person alone. Mira pressed her hands together and thought about her choices. She could try to move the rocks little by little, but it might take weeks, and the danger of being trapped under shifting stone was real. She could also seek help, but the moment another person knew about the gold, her secret would no longer be hers. Trust was as risky as the cave itself. That morning, she walked to the stream and followed it back toward the bend. She studied the pile of rocks once more. The hollow behind them whispered of deep tunnels. The air that slipped through was cold and carried the scent of earth untouched for many years. Mira placed her hand against the stone and promised herself she would not give up. On her way back, she saw a figure moving through the trees. Her heart raced and she crouched behind a bush. The figure was a man carrying a bundle of sticks for firewood. His face was worn, his clothes rough, and his step slow. She recognized him. His name was Tomas, a man from the town who sometimes wandered the hills to hunt or gather wood. He was known as quiet and simple, not one who sought riches. Mira stepped out and greeted him. Tomas looked surprised to see her so far from the road. She told him that she had inherited the cabin and was trying to make a new life in the hills. He nodded and said the land was lonely but peaceful. They spoke for a short while before he left with his bundle. That night, Mira thought about him. Could he be trusted? He was not greedy from what she knew, but she could not be sure. She needed someone strong to help clear the stones, yet if she chose wrongly, she might lose the mine forever. For several days she worked alone. She carried smaller stones from the pile, stacking them to the side. Each evening her hands bled from the sharp edges and her body ached. She made only a small gap, enough to let in more air but not enough to enter. The work seemed endless. On the 5th day, while she was resting near the stream, Thomas appeared again. He carried a rabbit he had trapped and offered to share it with her. They cooked it together over a fire. Mira felt warmth not only from the food but from the company. She had been alone for many weeks, and his quiet voice gave her comfort. As they ate, Thomas spoke of the hills. He knew the paths, the hidden springs, and the places where wolves hunted. Mira listened carefully. She wondered if fate had sent him to her at this time. At last, she made a choice. She decided to tell him part of the truth, though not all. She spoke of the journal, but she called it an old notebook from her uncle. She said it mentioned a cave in the hills where valuable ore might be found. She explained that she had discovered the cave but could not move the rocks by herself. Thomas looked at her with steady eyes. He asked if she was certain about what she had read. Mira nodded and showed him a page of the journal that spoke of the sealed cave, though she hid the parts about gold and treasure. After a long silence, Thomas agreed to help. He said he had nothing to lose, for he owned no land and lived by his hands alone. If the cave held something useful, perhaps it could give them both a better life. The next day, they began the hard work together. With 2 pairs of hands, the stones moved faster. Thomas used a crowbar he carried, while Mira cleared the smaller rocks. Hours passed and the pile slowly shrank. The gap grew wider and a dark space appeared beyond. Cold air poured out stronger than before. At one point, a large stone shifted and nearly crushed Mira's foot, but Thomas pulled her away just in time. They laughed in relief, though both were shaken. Mira realized that danger was not only from greedy men, but also from the earth itself. After several days, they had opened a space wide enough to crawl through. They stood at the entrance, their lanterns ready, their hearts heavy with both fear and excitement. Mira held the journal and Thomas carried the rope. Together they entered the cave. The air inside was cool and damp. The walls were rough and the floor sloped downward. Their lanterns cast flickering light on the stone, revealing patterns of quartz and veins of darker rock. The passage twisted, then opened into a wide chamber. Mira gasped as the light touched the walls. Small flecks of gold glittered in the stone. The outlaw had spoken true. This was the lost mine. Mira's hands shook as she touched the wall. She could feel the rough stone and see the golden sparks that caught the lantern light. Riches lay hidden in these hills more than she had ever dreamed. But Thomas stepped back and looked at her. He said softly that they must be careful. Gold could bring not only wealth but also trouble. If word spread, others would come and violence would follow. Mira agreed. They swore to keep the place secret until they decided what to do. As they explored deeper, they found wooden beams left by the outlaw long ago. Some had rotted and the roof sagged in places. Mira realized that the mine was not safe. If they dug carelessly, the tunnels might collapse. The treasure was real, but it was locked within danger. When they returned to the cabin that night, Mira could not sleep. She sat by the fire and stared into the flames. The gold was within her reach, yet the path to claim it was full of risk. She also wondered if Thomas would remain true. He seemed honest, but gold tested every heart. Thomas, too, seemed troubled. He spoke little, but Mira saw the way his eyes drifted toward the journal whenever she opened it. He had saved her from the falling stone, and she felt she owed him trust, but a small seed of doubt had been planted. As the days passed, they returned to the mine again and again. They studied the walls, planned where to dig, and gathered tools. Mira wrote notes in her own book, copying each new discovery. One evening, as they sat outside the cabin, Thomas asked her a question. He wanted to know if she truly believed her uncle had written the journal. Mira hesitated. She realized that sooner or later he would learn the full truth. She looked into the hills and answered slowly. She said the journal was not her uncle's but belonged to someone long dead, a man who had been chased and hunted. She said the man had hidden his secret in these pages, and now it had fallen into her hands. Thomas listened, his face calm. At last he nodded and said he would not betray her. He promised that the secret was safe. Mira studied him carefully and decided for the moment to believe him. But as she blew out the lantern and lay in bed, she wondered what the future would bring. The gold was real, but so were fear, greed, and danger. The hills seemed to whisper outside her window, telling her that her journey was only beginning. And Mira knew that every step forward would test her courage more than the last. The days that followed were filled with work, silence, and growing tension. Mira and Thomas returned to the mine each morning, carrying tools and lanterns. Together they studied the walls where golden flecks shone. Thomas struck with his hammer, and Mira gathered the broken pieces into a sack. The work was slow, and the gold that came out in small flakes was little compared to what she imagined lay deeper inside. At night, They carried the sacks back to the cabin and hid them beneath the floorboards. The secret weight grew, and so did the silence between them. Mira often sat alone by the fire, staring at the journal, while Thomas sharpened his tools without speaking. Mira began to notice small changes in him. His voice grew sharper when he spoke, and his eyes lingered too long on the sacks under the floor. Once, when she set the journal on the table, he reached for it quickly before pulling his hand back as if he had made a mistake. Mira said nothing, but her heart felt uneasy. One evening, as the firelight flickered, Thomas asked her how much gold she thought the mine truly held. She answered carefully, saying that no one could know. He pressed again, saying the outlaw must have hidden a fortune there, enough to make them richer than anyone in town. Mira nodded, but reminded him that greed had destroyed many men before. Thomas laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. He said he had lived with nothing all his life, and now fortune was finally before him. Mira studied him in silence, her hands tightening on the journal. She feared that the gold was already changing him. The next morning, as they returned to the mine, Mira noticed something strange. The ground near the cave showed footprints that were not theirs. She knelt and touched the soil. The prints were fresh. Her stomach twisted. Someone else had been near their secret. She turned to Thomas, but he shook his head. He swore he had told no one. Mira believed him for the moment, yet her fear deepened. If another person had found the place, danger was close. They worked quickly inside the mine that day, but Mira's hands trembled as she lifted the lantern. Every shadow looked like a stranger hiding. She whispered that they should take only what they could carry, and leave the rest hidden for now. Thomas frowned, saying they would be fools to walk away when riches lay waiting. But at last he agreed to stop for the day. When they returned to the cabin, Mira could not rest. She lit the lantern and read the journal again. She searched for any warning she had missed. She found a line she had overlooked before. If others follow, trust no one, for greed is sharper than any blade. Mira felt the words strike deep. That night, rain fell hard on the roof, and the wind howled. Mira lay awake in the loft, clutching the journal. Below, Thomas slept near the fire, his face hidden in shadow. Mira thought of the footprints and wondered who had left them. Were they from a hunter passing by, or from someone who had followed them? The next day, she decided to test Thomas's honesty. As they walked to the mine, she told him she planned to sell the small flakes of gold in town to buy more tools. She said she would go alone. Thomas's face darkened. He argued that they should both go, that he should hold half the gold. Mira shook her head and said the town knew her as the rightful owner of the cabin, so suspicion would fall less on her. Thomas was silent, but his jaw tightened. Mira saw the storm building in him, though he spoke no more. She traveled to town alone with a small pouch of gold hidden in her dress. She sold it to the blacksmith, who paid her fairly without asking too many questions. With the coin, she bought stronger boots, new tools, and more food. As she walked through the market, she noticed a stranger watching her. He was tall, with a scar across his cheek, and his eyes followed her every step. Mira turned away quickly and hurried back to the hills. When she told Thomas about the stranger, his face grew pale. He said the man's name was Raoul, a drifter known for gambling and asking too many questions. Mira feared then that their secret was no longer safe. That night, as thunder rolled over the hills, Mira and Thomas argued for the first time. Thomas said they should dig faster and take as much gold as they could before others arrived. Mira argued that rushing would cause the mine to collapse. She begged him to be patient. Thomas slammed his hand on the table, saying patience was for the poor. Mira's heart sank. The gold was taking him farther from the quiet man she had trusted. The following days were filled with worry. Mira worked, but her eyes never stopped searching the woods for signs of others. Twice she thought she saw figures in the distance, but when she looked again, they were gone. Thomas grew restless, leaving the cabin at night without telling her where he went. Mira asked, but he gave no answer. One evening, as she prepared supper, Mira found that the journal was missing from the table. Panic struck her. She searched the loft, the shelves, and the floorboards, but it was gone. When Thomas returned, she asked him if he had seen it. He said no, but his eyes shifted away from hers. She did not press further, but inside her trust broke like glass. Without the journal, she still remembered the clues, but she feared what Thomas might do if he truly held it. She began hiding small pieces of gold in secret places around the cabin, places he would not think to look. She told herself that if greed drove him mad, she would still have enough to survive. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. One morning, when Mira woke, she found Thomas already gone. She searched the cabin but saw no sign of him. Fear gripped her. Had he gone to town? Had he spoken to Raoul? Or had he gone to the mine alone, taking the journal with him? Mira hurried to the cave. The air was still, but fresh footprints marked the ground. Inside, the lantern marks on the wall showed he had been there. She followed the tunnel until she found fresh rubble. Thomas had struck too deep and part of the roof had fallen. He was not there now, but the danger was clear. She stood in the darkness, her lantern shaking, and whispered to herself that the mine would destroy them if they let greed guide their steps. She turned back, determined to keep control before it was too late. But as she reached the cabin, she saw smoke in the distance, not from her chimney, but from another fire in the trees. Someone else was there, watching, waiting. Mira's heart pounded. The secret was no longer only between her and Thomas. Others had entered the hills, drawn by whispers of gold, and the struggle for the outlaw's treasure was about to begin. The morning sun rose gently over the hills, and Mira woke with heavy eyes. She had slept near the fire in the cabin after returning from her long search the previous day. The outlaw's journal rested on the table, its pages spread open. She touched it with careful hands, knowing it had led her to a place that most would never find. The words inside had changed her life, and now she faced a decision that weighed more than the gold itself. Her mind replayed every moment she had spent in the hidden cave, the glitter of the ore, the strange silence, and the thought of how many people had once fought or died for this treasure. It was true the mine was real and the gold was there, but so was the shadow of danger. Mira remembered the sound of shifting stones and how the cave walls felt unstable. She knew the treasure was both a gift and a curse. She stepped outside the cabin and breathed the cold air. The hills stretched out in silence, only broken by the song of a bird far away. Mira wrapped her shawl tightly around her and walked toward the trail. She felt that the land itself was watching her, as if waiting to see what she would choose. The journal gave clear signs, but it also carried warnings. On the last page, the outlaw had written a single note in shaky letters. It said that the gold would bring more sorrow than joy, that it would divide men and ruin families. Mira thought about her husband's debts, about the hunger she had faced, and about the freedom she longed for. She wanted peace, not endless struggle. Later that day, Mira visited the town. She carried the journal in her bag, but she did not speak of it to anyone. She bought a small loaf of bread and traded some blankets she had found in the cabin. People in the town looked at her with curiosity, some with pity. They whispered that she was living in the old cabin, the place many feared to enter. No one asked what she had found there, and she gave them no reason to wonder. In the evening, she sat with an old man near the well. His name was Thomas, a farmer who had lost much to drought. Mira listened as he spoke of hard times and how greed had ruined neighbors who once trusted each other. She realized that if she revealed the mine, it would bring men with shovels, guns, and endless desire. The hills would no longer be quiet, and the peace she had found would vanish. That night she returned to the cabin with a new thought in her mind. She lit the lamp and opened the journal again. She read each line slowly, memorizing the landmarks and the directions. Then she closed it and set it on the table. Her hand trembled as she reached for the fire. With one deep breath, she fed the journal into the flames. The leather cover curled, the ink turned black, and soon the outlaw's secrets were nothing but ash. Mira cried softly as she watched it burn. She was not mourning the loss of gold, but the weight of temptation that she could no longer carry. The hills would keep their treasure hidden and silent as they had for so many years, and she would keep her freedom. The next morning, Mira packed her few belongings and walked to the cave one last time. She stood at the entrance listening to the quiet wind. She left a small stone there, a sign to herself that she had been the last to know its secret. She did not step inside again. Instead, she turned back toward the cabin with a steady heart. Weeks passed, and Mira began to rebuild her life. She planted a small garden near the cabin and gathered water from the stream. Slowly, the place became a home. She found work helping neighbors with sewing and reading letters, for not everyone in town knew how to read. Her hands grew strong again, her face brighter. She was no longer the broken widow who had arrived with nothing. The cabin itself changed too. She cleaned the roof, fixed the windows, and painted the door with white lime. Travelers who passed the hills sometimes stopped to ask for water, and Mira always gave with kindness. People began to call her the woman of the hills, one who lived with courage and quiet strength. Though the secret of the mine burned to ash, Mira carried a different treasure in her heart. She had found hope in the land, peace in the silence, and freedom from the weight of greed. At night she sat by the fire looking at the stars and felt that her husband would be proud of the path she had chosen. One evening, Thomas visited her with his granddaughter. He looked around the cabin and smiled. He said that Mira had brought new life to a place that once seemed cursed. The child laughed as she played in the yard, and Mira realized the cabin was no longer only hers. It had become a place of warmth for others too. Time moved on and seasons changed. The hills kept their secrets silent and untouched. Mira never spoke of the mine, never told of the journal, but sometimes when she walked near the old trail, she would pause and listen. She knew the treasure was still there, hidden in stone, waiting for another hand that might never come. In her heart, she felt at peace with her choice. She had gained something greater than gold. She had gained the strength to rise again, to live with honor, and to build a life not chained by greed. And so the widow who once came to the cabin with empty hands became known as the woman who turned sorrow into hope. Her story spread quietly, not of lost gold or outlaw riches, but of courage and the wisdom to walk away from temptation. The hills stood tall around her cabin, guarding both the mine and the woman who chose a different kind of treasure.